The cold had teeth that night, not the kind that nips at exposed skin, but the kind that burrows into bone and refuses to let go. Ayita Whitefeather stood in the doorway of her cabin, breath crystallizing before her weathered face, and watched something that shouldn't exist. Across the white expanse of her land, shadows moved in numbers that defied nature. 50, 70, more. The track she'd found that morning had told a story she didn't want to believe. Now, as moonlight caught yellow eyes in every direction, she understood that the winter had driven something broken into the mountains. They'd come for her last calf, and they weren't leaving until one side stopped breathing. The wind carried their scent, now wild, desperate, hungry beyond reason. Ayita's fingers tightened around the rifle her grandfather had carried, the wood smooth from generations of hands that knew what it meant to stand when everything told you to run. Behind her, in the reinforced corral she'd spent 3 days building, the calf made a sound that cut through the howling air. Not quite fear yet, just awareness that something had changed in the world. She'd lost the others to the cold. 5 head of cattle, frozen where they stood when the storm came through harder than anyone remembered. The calf survived only because she'd been small enough to fit in the corner of the barn, pressed against the last warm stones of a dying fire. Insurance money wouldn't come. Banks didn't care about distant properties where old women lived alone by choice. The meat in her cellar would last another month if she rationed. After that, without the calf to trade or breed, she'd have to leave the land that held every memory of her people. That wasn't going to happen. Ayita pulled the heavy coat tighter and stepped into the snow. Each footfall crunched loud enough to announce her presence to anything listening. Good. Let them know she was coming. The rifle held 6 rounds. She had another dozen in her pocket. 18 shots against a pack that looked like it had absorbed every wolf from 3 mountain ranges. The math didn't work, but math had never been what kept her alive out here. Movement to her left. 3 wolves broke from the tree line, testing. They moved with the coordination of animals who'd hunted together long enough to think as one. The lead wolf, massive even at this distance, had a face marked by an old scar that split his muzzle. He stopped 30 paces out, watching her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. She raised the rifle, didn't aim at him, aimed at the snow 3 feet in front of his position. The shot cracked across the frozen landscape, echoing off the distant rocks. Snow erupted where the bullet hit. The 3 wolves scattered, but they didn't retreat far, just far enough to regroup. Ayita worked the bolt, chambered another round. 17 left. She'd done the math on that too. If she made every shot count, if she aimed for intimidation rather than kills, if she used everything her grandmother had taught her about animal behavior and fear, she might last until dawn, might keep them away from the corral long enough for the sun to drive them back to wherever desperation had dragged them from. The problem was the cold. She could feel it already, working into her joints the way it always did when she stayed outside too long. At 90, her body didn't generate heat the way it used to. Give it 3 hours in these conditions, she'd start making mistakes. 4 hours, her fingers wouldn't work the rifle properly. Dawn was 8 hours away. The alpha watched her from his new position. Behind him, the rest of the pack materialized from the darkness like smoke taking solid form. They fanned out, forming a loose circle that stretched wider than the reach of her firelight, testing the perimeter, looking for weakness. And in that moment, Ayita realized something that sent ice through her veins, colder than the winter wind. They weren't hunting like normal wolves. They were hunting like something that had learned patience from watching humans. She glanced back at the corral. The calf stared at her through the gaps in the wood, eyes reflecting the lamplight from the cabin, trusting, unaware that the next few hours would decide if either of them saw another sunrise. Ayita turned back to the darkness and whispered words in Apache that her grandmother had taught her. Not a prayer, a declaration. Then she stepped further into the snow, putting herself between the pack and everything she had left to lose. The wolves began to close in. They came in waves, like water testing the strength of a dam. First 3 from the north, then 5 from the east, forcing Ayita to pivot constantly. Each time she raised the rifle, they melted back into the darkness just beyond the reach of her lamplight. Not fleeing, repositioning. The alpha stayed back, watching from a small rise, coordinating with movements of his head that his pack obeyed without sound. Ayita fired twice more, both shots deliberate misses, close enough to send snow spraying into gray faces, far enough to conserve ammunition. 15 rounds left. The wolves learned faster than she wanted them to. After the 3rd shot, They stopped retreating as far. After the fifth, they barely flinched. Her hands were already starting to stiffen. She flexed her fingers inside the worn leather gloves, trying to keep blood flowing to the joints. The cold worked different at this age. It didn't just chill, it invaded, turned muscles sluggish, made every movement require thought that should have been instinct. She'd need to go back inside soon, warm her hands by the fire, or risk losing her grip on the rifle entirely. But the moment she turned her back, they'd test the corral. A sound made her spin left. 2 wolves at the fence line, one already up on its hind legs with paws against the wood. The calf screamed, a high sound of pure terror that cut through Aida's chest like a blade. She ran, boots punching through snow that grabbed at her ankles. The wolf dropped and backed away, but not far, just out of immediate reach. She examined the corral in the lamplight. The wood was solid, reinforced with rope and crossbeams she'd spent days securing. But the posts were old, sunk into ground that the freeze had turned iron hard. If enough weight hit them at once, physics didn't care how well she'd tied the joints. Movement behind her. Aida whirled, rifle up. The alpha stood 15 paces away, closer than he'd been all night. This near, she could see the scars that marked his face weren't just from one fight. This animal had survived things that killed other wolves. His pack hadn't gathered by chance, they'd been drawn to a leader who knew how to overcome what should have been impossible odds. The recognition hit her like a physical thing. He was doing to the mountains what she'd done to this land, refusing to leave, refusing to die, finding a way to survive when every rule said it couldn't be done. The difference was, she had something to protect. He had something to take. They stared at each other across the snow, 2 creatures carved from the same stone of pure stubbornness. Behind her, the calf went quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. Around them, the rest of the pack held position, waiting for the signal that would change everything. Aida spoke in Apache, words her grandmother had used when predators came near the sheep. Not a threat, a statement of territory, a line drawn in snow that had nothing to do with weakness or surrender, and everything to do with what happened when you pushed something that had already decided it wasn't moving. The alpha's ears flicked forward. He understood tone, if not words. For 5 heartbeats, she thought he might back down, take his pack to easier prey. Then he lifted his head and made a sound she'd never heard from a wolf. Not a howl. Something between a bark and a roar, sharp and commanding. Every wolf in the darkness answered, and Aida realized with dropping certainty that what she'd thought was a test had only been reconnaissance. The real attack was about to begin. They came as one organism, converging from 4 directions simultaneously. Aida fired east, chambered, fired north, spun west. The wolves hit the corral fence with coordinated impact that sent vibrations through the frozen ground. Wood groaned. The calf went down on its front knees, bleeding in panic. She couldn't shoot them all. The realization crystallized as she watched gray bodies flow around the perimeter like floodwater seeking cracks in a levee. 12 rounds left. Maybe 60 wolves visible now, with more materializing from the darkness. The math had become impossible. Aida made a decision that went against every instinct. She stopped shooting to kill, or scare. Instead, she fired a single round straight up. The crack echoed off the mountain faces, sharp and commanding. Then she started moving. Her grandmother's voice came back across decades. Wolves fear unpredictability more than size. Be the thing they can't understand. She ran at the nearest cluster, rifle raised like a club, voice erupting in a war cry her people had used when cavalry thought numbers meant victory. The sound tore from her throat, raw and ancient. 3 wolves scattered. She pivoted, charged another group, this time silent, changing the pattern. They retreated, not from fear of the weapon, but from confusion about what she'd do next. But she couldn't be everywhere. While she drove back the north side, wolves tested the south fence. She heard wood crack, spun, fired low. The bullet hit snow between fence and wolf. 11 rounds. The animal yelped and bolted, but the damage was done. One of the lower crossbeams had splintered. The cold was winning its own battle. Her breath came harder now, each lungful of frozen air like swallowing knives. Sweat from the running had soaked the inner layer of her clothes, and that moisture was already starting to freeze against her skin. Her left knee, the one she'd injured decades ago falling from a horse, was beginning to lock up. Each step required conscious effort to keep the joint moving. The alpha watched from his position, learning. She could see it in the way he tilted his head, processing. She'd bought minutes, not hours. Once he understood her pattern, Once the pack figured out she couldn't maintain this intensity, they'd adapt again. Aita retreated to the corral, putting her back against the solid wood. The calf pressed against the fence from inside, seeking the warmth of her presence through the barrier. She reached through the gap, let her gloved hand rest on the animal's neck. The small body trembled, heart racing so fast she could feel it against her palm. "Not tonight," she whispered. "You don't die tonight." Movement caught her eye. The alpha was walking forward, deliberate and slow, not charging, approaching. He stopped just beyond rifle range and sat, posture radiating patience. Behind him, the pack settled into waiting positions. The message was clear. They could afford to wait for exhaustion and cold to do their work. She could not. Aita pulled her hand back, checked the corral one more time. The splintered beam worried her, but the structure would hold through another assault or two. Maybe 3 if she got lucky. After that, the wolves wouldn't need to break through. They'd just need to push until the weak point failed. Her eyes went to the cabin, 20 paces behind the corral. Inside, a fire still burned. She could go back, warm herself, think through options. But those 20 paces might as well be 20 miles. The moment she moved toward shelter, they'd surge forward, and she'd never make it back to the fence in time. The wind picked up, carrying crystals of ice that stung exposed skin. Through the gust, she heard something that made her stomach drop. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the pack, more howls answered. Not the coordinated sound of this group. Different voices, different territory markers. This wasn't one pack driven to desperation. This was multiple packs, drawn together by hunger so severe it had overridden every natural boundary wolves observed. Aita understood then what she was really facing. The winter hadn't just made them desperate. It had made them something else entirely. The new arrivals emerged from the tree line like ghosts taking form. Smaller than the first pack, leaner with coats darker and eyes that caught the lamplight different. Aita counted quickly. 20 more. Maybe 25. The alpha from her original pack turned his head, acknowledged them with a low sound that wasn't quite welcome and wasn't quite challenge. A temporary alliance, born from starvation that made enemies into conspirators. 100 wolves, give or take. The title everyone would hear about later wasn't exaggeration. It was just counting. Her thermometer, nailed to the cabin wall, showed 25 degrees below freezing. The kind of cold that killed exposed flesh in minutes. That turned steel brittle, that made breathing feel like drowning. She'd been outside for nearly 2 hours. Her toes had gone numb 30 minutes ago. Now her fingers were following, the tips losing sensation even inside the gloves. Aita made it back to the cabin in a calculated sprint, rifle ready for the surge she knew would come. It did wolves rushing the corral the moment her back turned. She grabbed the oil lamp from the hook beside her door, pivoted, hurled it toward the thickest cluster. Glass shattered. Fire bloomed across snow in a spreading pool that sent wolves scrambling backward, yelping at the sudden light and heat. She'd bought another few minutes. Inside the cabin she moved fast, grabbed 3 more oil lamps, the half bottle of whiskey she'd been saving, a wool blanket. Her hands shook as she worked, partly from cold, partly from the adrenaline that had been flooding her system for hours. She held her fingers over the stove, felt nothing, then watched with detachment as feeling came back in waves of pain that made her gasp. 20 seconds. That's all she could afford. Back outside, the fire from the first lamp had burned down to scattered flames. The wolves had reorganized, staying just beyond the light. But they'd learned. Fire was temporary. Fire went out. She set up a perimeter 3 lamps positioned in a triangle around the corral, each one giving her a barrier of light. The whiskey she poured in a careful line from lamp to lamp, creating a channel that would carry flame if she needed to connect them. The blanket she soaked in water from her bucket, then draped over the damaged section of corral. Wet wool wouldn't burn if they tried to set the fence on fire with their body heat and friction. Smart wolves. Desperate wolves. She couldn't assume they'd only attack from ignorance. The alpha watched her preparations with what looked unsettlingly like calculation. When she finished, he rose from his sitting position and began to pace along the perimeter, examining her defenses. Other wolves followed his path, studying the same angles. She recognized the behavior she'd seen it in hunting parties, warriors assessing fortifications before a raid. 11 rounds remained. At some point, she'd have to choose between conserving ammunition for the final stand, or using it now to prevent things from reaching that point. Both choices felt wrong. Both led to the same ending if dawn didn't come faster than her body gave out. The temperature dropped another degree. She could feel it. The way the air changed texture, became something solid pressing against exposed skin. Her face had gone numb where the scarf didn't cover. Her knee was beyond pain now, locked almost straight, forcing her to pivot her whole body instead of just turning. She should have left yesterday. Should have walked down the mountain when the storms cleared, sought shelter in the valley, let the winter take what it wanted. Pride had kept her here. Pride and the memory of her grandmother's voice saying that white feathers didn't run from their land just because the season turned hard. But her grandmother hadn't faced this. No one had. The second pack's alpha, the darker one, suddenly broke from the group and rushed the corral alone. A test. Ayita raised the rifle, tracked his movement, squeezed the trigger just as he veered left. The bullet caught his shoulder, not fatal but enough. He went down, rolled, came up on 3 legs, and limped back to the pack. 10 rounds left. She'd wanted to miss. Wanted to conserve the ammunition, but her hands had been shaking too much to trust the precision. The realization hit hard her body was failing faster than her will. Soon, choice would stop mattering. Physics and biology would make decisions for her. The wounded alpha's pack surged forward in response to his injury, anger overriding caution. Ayita grabbed the nearest lamp and threw it into their path. Fire spread. They scattered. But this time, several wolves circled around, coming at the corral from the blind side. She heard the wood crack before she saw it. The wet blanket had slipped. 3 wolves hit the weakened section together. The entire wall shifted inward 6 inches before holding. The calf screamed, and Ayita knew the next attack would be the one that broke through. The attack came in a rush of gray bodies and yellow eyes. 20 wolves hitting the damaged section at once. The corral wall didn't break, it exploded inward. Posts ripping from frozen ground, boards splintering with sounds like gunshots. The calf bolted toward the opposite corner, trapped inside what had become a collapsing cage. Ayita fired 3 times in rapid succession, not aiming, just creating noise and chaos. 7 rounds left. The wolves recoiled from the muzzle flashes but didn't retreat far. They'd crossed a threshold. Blood scent from their wounded packmate had triggered something deeper than hunger, more primal than desperation. She grabbed a burning fence board from where her lamp fire had spread, swung it like a club at the nearest wolf. Fur singed. The animal yelped and fell back, but there were too many. For every one she drove off, 2 more pressed forward from different angles. Her knee gave out. The joint that had been threatening to fail for the past hour finally did, buckling sideways with a sensation like something tearing inside. She went down hard, catching herself on her left hand. The rifle skittered across packed snow, just out of reach. A wolf lunged for her exposed back. She rolled, pain screaming through the damaged knee, came up with her knife in hand. The blade caught the animal under the jaw, not deep enough to kill, but enough to send it tumbling away. Hot blood steamed in the cold air, splattered across her coat. The calf was screaming continuously now, a sound that cut through everything else. Ayita dragged herself toward the rifle, each movement sending waves of nausea through her body. The knee wasn't just damaged, something had torn completely. She could feel the joint moving wrong, bone grinding where it shouldn't. She reached the rifle, rolled onto her back, fired twice more at wolves circling the calf. 5 rounds. Both shots went wide. Her hands were shaking too hard, vision blurring at the edges. Hypothermia wasn't coming, it had arrived. Her body temperature had dropped past the point where she could trust her coordination. The alpha stepped through the broken corral wall, moving slow and deliberate. He paused, studying her, calculating whether she was still a threat or just prey that hadn't finished dying. Behind him, his pack waited, a wall of muscle and hunger that filled every gap in the damaged fence. Ayita tried to stand. Her left leg responded. Her right leg wouldn't take weight. She made it to one knee, rifle braced against her thigh, breathing in ragged gasps that sent ice crystals through her lungs. Blood from the wolf's jaw still stained her knife, already freezing into a dark glaze on the blade. "Come on," she said, voice hoarse. Not a plea, an invitation. The alpha's ears flicked forward. Around them, the other wolves shifted, reading his body language for the signal that would end this. The calf had gone silent, pressed into the far corner, eyes wide with an animal's understanding that predators had won. Then something changed in the air, a shift so subtle Ayita almost missed it. The alpha's head came up, nostrils flaring. Other wolves turned, testing the wind from the east. For 3 heartbeats, The entire pack held perfectly still. A new scent had reached them. Not prey, not territory marker. Something else. One of the younger wolves broke position, trotted toward the tree line, then broke into a run. Others followed. Within seconds, 15 wolves had abandoned the corral, flowing back into the forest like water finding a drain. The alpha remained, but even he turned his head, torn between the certainty of the calf and the possibility of whatever had caught the wind. Ayita didn't question it. She used the distraction to reload with fingers so numb she couldn't feel if the bullet seated properly. Her emergency ammunition, the 6 rounds she'd kept in her innermost pocket, close to her body heat. They were her last. 11 total shells remaining in the world for her. The alpha made his choice. He barked once, sharp and final, and the rest of his pack disengaged, following the others toward whatever had drawn them away. In 30 seconds, the number of wolves surrounding her property had dropped from nearly 100 to maybe 30. The second pack, the darker ones, they'd stayed, and their alpha, the one she'd wounded, sat watching her with eyes that promised this wasn't mercy. This was just a different kind of patience. His pack had learned what hers had that she couldn't stand, couldn't run, couldn't defend more than the immediate space around her body. They didn't need to rush. They just needed to wait for her to bleed out, freeze, or pass out from pain. The knee was already swelling inside her boot. Pressure building. If the cold didn't kill her, shock from the injury might. Ayita met the wounded alpha's gaze across the snow. 25 wolves to her 11 bullets. But now, there was space to maneuver, room to think, and 4 hours until dawn instead of 8. She pulled herself upright using the corral fence, tested putting weight on the bad leg, bit down on a scream when the knee shifted wrong. Not broken, torn, ligament damage, maybe cartilage. She'd walked on worse once years ago, but she'd been 40 then. The calf stumbled toward her through the wreckage, seeking protection it didn't understand was barely there. Ayita wrapped one arm around its neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat, the trembling that matched her own. They stood together in the ruins of the corral, 2 creatures that had survived past the point where logic said they should have died. The darker wolves began to circle again. She couldn't defend the corral anymore. The structure was gone, reduced to scattered boards and broken posts. Ayita made a choice that felt like surrender, but was actually the opposite. She started moving toward the cabin, dragging the calf with her, one arm locked around its neck while the other held the rifle. Each step was negotiation between her will and her body. The right leg wouldn't bend at the knee. She had to swing it forward stiff, like a piece of wood attached to her hip. Pain radiated up through her spine with every impact. 3 steps. Rest. Breathe. 4 more steps. The cabin door was 15 feet away. Might as well have been a mile. The darker wolves paced alongside, matching her speed, cutting off any path that didn't lead exactly where she was going. They understood she was wounded. They understood wounded prey moved toward dens, toward corners, toward places with no escape. This wasn't hurting. This was allowing her to trap herself. She fell twice. The second time, her vision went gray at the edges, mind trying to shut down from the combination of pain and cold and exhaustion. The calf nudged her shoulder with its nose, the warm breath against her face pulling her back. She grabbed a fence post, used it as a crutch, forced herself upright. 10 feet to the door. The wounded alpha rose from his position. His shoulder where she'd shot him was stiff, movement hitched on that side. But pain made him more dangerous, not less. He'd lost face when she'd hurt him in front of his pack. This wasn't about food anymore. This was personal. He moved between her and the cabin door, blocking, claiming the space she needed. Behind him, his pack fanned out, covering the approaches. If she tried to go around, they'd close in from the sides. If she tried to go through him, he'd have her on the ground before she could raise the rifle. Ayita stopped. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one feeling like it might be the last her lungs could manage. The thermometer on the cabin wall read 27 below now. The wind chill was probably pushing it past 30. Exposed skin died in minutes at these temperatures. She'd been outside for nearly 4 hours. Her face had no feeling. Her hands could barely grip. Her injured leg was just dead weight, the joint swollen so tight inside her boot that she could feel the leather stretching. And somewhere deep in her core, her body temperature had dropped low enough that she was starting to feel warm, false warmth, the kind that made freezing people take off their coats right before they died. She had 11 bullets, 30 wolves. and a choice. Use the ammunition to clear a path to the cabin door, get inside where fire and walls could protect her, but abandon the calf to certain death. Or stay in the open, defending an animal she could no longer move, and freeze to death in the next hour whether the wolves attacked or not. The calf pressed against her leg, the good one, still trusting that she had some plan, some way to make this work. It didn't understand that plans required options, and she was down to watching which way she preferred to die. Aida looked at the wounded alpha. In his eyes, she saw the same calculation she was making. He knew she was considering abandoning the calf, knew that if she did, his pack would be on it before she cleared the threshold, knew that even if she made it inside, barricaded the door, survived until dawn, she'd have to live with leaving something behind that had depended on her. He was offering her a trade, her life for its life, her survival for her failure. Her grandmother's voice came back one more time. The hardest part of being Apache isn't knowing when to fight. It's knowing what you're really fighting for. Aida made her decision. She pushed the calf away, hard enough that it stumbled and fell in the snow. Then she turned her back on the cabin door and began hobbling in the opposite direction, away from shelter, away from warmth, toward the open ground where her remaining lamp still burned in a triangle of failing light. The wolves watched, confused by the choice. Prey didn't move away from dens. Wounded animals didn't choose exposure over shelter. But she wasn't moving like prey anymore. She was moving like something that had decided what it was willing to lose and what it absolutely was not. The calf scrambled to its feet, followed her, bleeding in confusion. She didn't push it away again. If it was coming, it was choosing. Aida reached the center of her lamp triangle, where the snow was trampled from hours of fighting, where the blood from earlier attacks had frozen into dark patches on white ground. She checked the rifle. 11 rounds, planted her good leg, braced the damaged one, and raised the weapon. The wounded alpha stood at the edge of the light, head tilted, trying to understand what she was doing, why she'd given up the advantage of walls and door, why she was making herself more vulnerable instead of less. Then his eyes tracked past her, to the cabin behind, and his ears flicked forward in sudden comprehension. Inside that structure was heat, smoke, her scent, everything that marked territory. Out here in the open, in the cold, surrounded by the smell of wolf blood and her own sweat, this was neutral ground. This was the place where neither side had advantage. This was where she'd chosen to make her stand, not behind walls, not in corners. In the place where Apache had always fought best, in the open, with clear sight lines, where courage mattered more than protection. She spoke in her language. Words that her grandmother had taught her meant, "I see you," an acknowledgement between warriors. Then she chambered around and waited. The pack closed in from all sides. They came in sequence, not all at once. The wounded alpha had learned enough to know overwhelming force would trigger her to fire wildly, waste ammunition. Instead, he sent them in controlled waves. 3 from the north, wait, 4 from the east, testing which direction she favored, where her blind spots formed when she pivoted on the damaged leg. Aida fired twice, dropped 2 wolves that came too close. 9 rounds left. The bodies fell and didn't rise. The rest of the pack paused, reassessing. She'd drawn a line in the snow with blood. Everything inside the lamp circle was defended territory. Everything outside belonged to them. But territory meant nothing when your body was shutting down. She could feel her core temperature dropping past critical. Her thoughts were starting to fragment, losing the thread of what came next. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. Her hands had stopped shaking because they'd stopped feeling anything at all. The calf stayed pressed against her good leg, the only source of warmth in the entire frozen world. Its body heat was the only thing reminding her that she was still capable of feeling temperature differences. Without it, she might have already sat down in the snow and never stood again. Another rush. 6 wolves this time, coordinated, hitting from 3 directions simultaneously. She fired once, chambered, fired again. 2 more bodies. 7 rounds. But the third wolf got through, jaws closing on the heavy leather of her coat sleeve. The animal's weight pulled her sideways. She went down, rifle trapped beneath her, wolf on top shaking its head to tear through to meet. She got the knife into its ribs with her free hand, felt the blade punch through fur and flesh. The wolf yelped and released, stumbled away trailing blood that steamed in the frozen air. She scrambled back upright, every movement sending lightning through the ruined knee. The wounded alpha stepped forward himself. Done testing. Done waiting. His pack closed in behind him, a wall of muscle and hunger that left no gaps. This was the end of strategy. This was the moment where numbers won. Aida raised the rifle. 7 rounds for 30 wolves. The math had never worked. Wouldn't work now. But mathematics didn't account for what happened when something decided the cost of losing was worse than the cost of dying. She fired 4 shots in rapid succession. Not at wolves. At the oil lamps. Glass shattered. Fuel sprayed. Fire erupted in 3 directions, creating walls of flame that cut the pack's advance routes. 3 rounds left. The wolves scattered from the fire, breaking formation, the carefully coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. But fire and snow didn't last. Already the flames were dying, fuel consumed. Heat insufficient to sustain combustion in air this cold. 30 seconds. That's what she'd bought. 30 seconds while they regrouped, reassessed, came at her from angles the fire hadn't blocked. She used it to pour the last of her water on the calf's legs, then on her own coat. The liquid froze almost instantly, creating a thin shell of ice. It wouldn't stop teeth, but it would slow them. Make the first bite harder to establish. Give her 1 or 2 extra seconds. The alpha came through the dying flames, coat singed, eyes locked on her with intelligence that was almost human. He'd figured out she was out of tricks, out of options, out of everything except the will to keep standing. Aida met his charge with the rifle stock, swinging it like a club, connecting with his wounded shoulder. He yelped, but didn't retreat, powerful jaws clamping onto the wooden stock. They struggled, woman and wolf locked together, each trying to tear the weapon from the other. Her boot slipped. She went to one knee, the bad one, pain so intense it cleared the fog from her mind for one perfect moment of clarity. In that moment, she saw the sky. The stars were fading. The darkness that had seemed eternal was starting to thin at the edges. Dawn was coming. She abandoned the rifle, let the alpha have it, pulled her knife and drove it up into his exposed throat as he reared back with his prize. Not deep enough to kill, deep enough to make him drop the weapon and stagger backward, blood pouring down his chest. 3 rounds left in a rifle she could no longer reach. Knife in hand. 30 wolves. Most of them fresh. And 4 miles to the east, the first gray hint of approaching sunrise touched the horizon. The pack sensed it too. Their behavior changed. Urgency replacing patience. They'd learned from thousands of years of evolution that daylight meant danger, meant visibility, meant losing the advantages that made them apex predators. They had maybe 20 minutes before the sun crested the mountains. Every wolf charged at once. Aida grabbed the calf, dragged it against her body, turned her back to shield it. Teeth found her coat, her boots, tearing at leather and wool. She stabbed blindly, felt the knife connect, pull free, connect again. Heat from the animals pressed against the cold. Pain merged into one continuous signal her brain couldn't separate into individual injuries. She was dying. She knew it. Could feel her consciousness starting to drift, the edges going soft, but the calf was still breathing against her chest. Still alive. That meant she was still succeeding. The horizon turned from gray to pink. First light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the chaos of teeth and fur and blood, the wolves felt it, felt their time running out. The wounded alpha made a sound, not a howl, a command, sharp, final, and against every instinct that told them to finish what they'd started, the pack began to retreat. They left in waves, the same way they'd come. First the younger wolves, then the females, finally the wounded alpha himself. He paused at the tree line, turned back one last time to look at her, not with hatred, with something closer to recognition. 2 creatures that had pushed past every reasonable limit and somehow remained standing when logic said they should have fallen. Then he was gone, gray shape disappearing into forest that was already less dark than it had been moments before. Aida collapsed, not a choice. Her body simply stopped obeying commands. She went down on her side in the trampled snow, the calf falling with her, both of them too exhausted to do anything but breathe. The knife was still in her hand, blade slick with blood that was freezing into dark ice. The sun broke over the mountain peak. Real light. Not the false gray of approaching dawn, but actual golden sunlight that touched her face with warmth she could feel even through the numbness. It illuminated the battlefield she'd created, scattered wolf bodies, broken fence posts, blood trails leading in every direction, oil lamp glass glittering like scattered diamonds. She'd lasted. Not won. Survived. The calf struggled to its feet first, stronger than she was. Younger, its body more capable of recovering. It nuzzled her face, warm breath against frozen skin. She tried to move, couldn't. Her body had spent everything it had. The hypothermia was advanced, the knee destroyed, multiple bite wounds bleeding through torn clothing. She'd need help, soon. But the nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the mountain, and she couldn't walk 3 feet. The calf pushed against her shoulder, bleeding, trying to get her to rise, not understanding that some things were beyond what flesh could do. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. When she opened them again, the sun was higher. An hour had passed, maybe 2, and there were voices, human voices, shouting her name. Her closest neighbor, Rollins, his face appearing above her, eyes wide with shock at the scene. Other men with him, 4 or 5, drawn by the gunshots they'd heard from the valley. "What in hell happened here?" Rollins asked, but it wasn't really a question. The evidence was everywhere. The wolf bodies, the destroyed corral, the blood. "I need you to get that calf into your barn," Aida said, voice barely a whisper. "Keep it warm, feed it, don't let it die. We need to get you to a doctor. The calf first. Promise me." Rollins looked at her, saw something in her face that made him nod. "All right, the calf first, but then you." They got her into the cabin, built up the fire, wrapped her in every blanket they could find. Someone rode for the doctor in the valley. Someone else counted the wolf bodies. 9 dead, they said. 9 wolves against a 90-year-old woman who couldn't walk, couldn't feel her hands, could barely see straight. They didn't understand that 9 bodies meant nothing against the 100 that had come. Didn't understand that the victory wasn't measured in what she'd killed, but in what she'd kept alive. The doctor came eventually, reset her knee, stitched the worst of the bite wounds, said words like remarkable and impossible and miracle that she ignored. There were no miracles, just decisions. Just refusing to stop when stopping would have been easier. 3 weeks later, when she could walk again with a cane, she went to Rollins's barn. The calf was there, healthy, growing strong on the milk from his cows. It recognized her immediately, pushed its head against her hand. "You keeping it?" Rollins asked. "For now," she said. "Until spring. Then I'll breed it. Build the herd back up. On that land? After what happened." She looked at him with eyes that had seen 100 wolves and decided they weren't reason enough to leave. "Especially after what happened. My grandmother told me white feathers don't run from their land. Took me 90 years to understand what that really meant." She walked back up the mountain that afternoon, slow but steady. The destroyed corral was still there, but it could be rebuilt. The cabin was still there, smoke rising from the chimney. The land was still there, holding the bones of her ancestors, carrying forward the future she'd refused to surrender. That night, when the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, she sat by the fire and listened to the silence beyond her walls. No howls, no scratches at the door. The wolves had learned the same lesson she'd proven, that some territories were defended by more than fences and bullets. They were defended by the choice to never back down, no matter how impossible the odds. The last calf of her herd had survived, and so had she. That was all the victory anyone needed. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage faces impossible odds and human spirit refuses to break. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories of survival and determination. Your support means everything.